Welcome to Morbid Symptoms Podcast. I'm your host, Tara Van Dyke, and we have quite a banger of a show for you. We're going to be tackling the Lily Phillips documentary, I Slept with 100 Men, but we're not going to focus on the salacious details or moralizing, pointing the finger about who's responsible for what happened on that particular day. Not that we're all entitled to our normative assessments, of course. But we want to try to use this as a case or as a prism to get at larger issues in terms of the downsides or the fallout from the sexual revolution that I guess started in earnest in the 60s when the birth control pill became widely accessible. The sexual revolution happened under conditions of capitalism. So we get into the increasing commodification of intimacy and sex and sexuality, how that's disenchanted things that maybe shouldn't have been so desacralized, making sex like going out for a coffee or giving somebody a pat on the back. And also the alienation that it causes, not only women, but also with men, which tend to get sidelined, limited as either perverts or predators or sexual, what should we call it, opportunists. I'm going to be joined by two other people. Nick is already on the stage, Nick Durie. Nick is a Scottish. He's also a member of the Alba party, and he ran for Glasgow North in the last elections. And if
Yes.
you want to say a bit more about yourself before we get into the meat of the matter.
Well, I'm a long-standing community activist, community organizer, tenant activist since I was 19 years old, 41 now, and a lifelong socialist. So I've obviously been observing the change in media because I'm from a family of engineers, and including software
Okay.
engineers. And so I always grew up with computers ever since I was 3 years old. So really the change in that media is kind of part of the story today.
Laura Jones will be joining us later, as well as Alexander Mckay from the Marx Engels Lenin Institute, who's going to be coming in and giving us Marxist Leninist interpretation of the Lily Phillips issue at the level of capitalism and of society, getting beyond the question of individual accountability or victimhood, that type of conversation that's been well fleshed out, I think, online. So I'm going to quickly go over what's going on here, Lily Phillips and the 100 Men, for people who aren't familiar with that, because it's a UK story. And then I'm going to go over one important framework for understanding how we got here, because it's not like this is singular when it comes to OnlyFans and pornography, prostitution. And there's some gray areas about OnlyFans, how to characterize it, since there's technically, in most cases, not touching, at least skin to skin. I should say this episode might not be suitable for young kids, although we're going to keep it fairly above board, but it is adult content. Anyway, so I'm going to bring in Louise Perry's book, Critical of the Sexual Revolution. She focused a lot on the downsides, how it's very much a mixed bag. Her argument would be that the sexual revolution tends to be only discussed in terms of progress, but she wants to focus in on the negative aspects of that, which I think can help us bring in an important dimension to this case. For me, what I want to have our panelists talk about tonight, it's not so much that individual case, because of course we can't be in Lily's mind or the people who participated, but I think that what's telling is the reactions to it that make it a cultural event or maybe a turning point, perhaps. What precipitated this episode? OnlyFans star Lily Phillips breaks down in tears after revealing she slept with 100 men in one day. This is the case that we're going to be interpreting today, culturally and politically, economically, and also, of course, for the relations between the sexes. So, for those of you who may not be familiar, Lily Phillips is, I guess we'd call her a content creator who rose to prominence through platforms like OnlyFans, and she's branded herself an advocate for sexual empowerment and built a significant following by marketing what she described as authentic and unapologetic embrace of modern sexual liberation. All right. But she's become a lightning rod for controversy when her personal and professional lives collide in a very public way. So she released this documentary, I think it was December 7th, titled I Slept with 100 Men in One Day. The OnlyFans model recalls sleeping with multiple men in one day in October to create not suitable for work content for her subscription based social media page. In one clip that has gone viral, the model can be seen breaking down into tears as she says she felt somewhat robotic sleeping with that many people in one day. This is a quote from Lily, according to People magazine. I think by the 30th, when they're getting on a bit, I've got a routine of how we're going to do this. And sometimes you just disassociate. And that's not like normal sex at all. In my head right now, I can think of all of like maybe 5 or 6 guys, 10 maybe, that I remember, and that's it. But it's just weird, isn't it? If I didn't have the videos, I wouldn't have known I've done 100. On November 5th, Phillips shared a TikTok saying that she was currently in training for her 1,000 men goal she hopes to achieve by January 2025. She noted that on December 15th, she'll be taking on 300 men, which she said is the most amount of guys have ever done. It's going to be hard, but in comparison to the 1,000, this should be light work, Phillips said on her TikTok. Earlier this year, she revealed that despite her vocal support for sex work and casual sex norms, that she'd been privately trying to transition to a more conventional lifestyle. Reports emerged that Phillips was actively seeking to distance herself from OnlyFans past as she attempted to enter serious relationships and pursue more traditional career path. These revelations were coupled with leaked messages where she allegedly expressed frustration that her past was making it difficult for her to be taken seriously by potential partners and employers. And I want to flag that because there's what people say, what's like socially acceptable to say, and how we react in real life or how we react in real time can be different. So, of course, your body, your business. If you want to do this, it's fine. People shouldn't be judged. But when it comes to dating somebody or employers and they find this out, I think that, it's not surprising that this would have a negative effect. So, how we react, like our natural reaction compared to the liberal social consensus, I think is something that also can get women, but not only women, into trouble if they take these cues too seriously, that the past is the past. Anyway, unsurprisingly, the internet has had a lot to say about this. Some saw her struggles as a cautionary tale, a sign of the cultural contradictions inherent in how we now approach sex, relationships, and work in the 20th century. I should probably caveat that with mostly Western countries. This isn't a global phenomenon. There's differences. Others accused her of being a hypocrite, arguing that you can't build a platform glorifying a lifestyle and then complain. But again, what I find useful about this case is not necessarily her individual story, it's what it reveals about our culture and the political economy. Phillips embodies the promises and pitfalls of the sexual revolution, kind of like the Samantha character in Fix and the City. On one hand, she represents open sexuality, casual, and defy presumably outdated norms. On the other hand, it highlights the persistent gap between those narratives about sexual liberation, the lived realities of those who try to embody them. So, this case touches on deeper issues. How much of our culture's celebration of sexual empowerment is rooted in genuine progress and how much is driven by capitalist accumulation and also alienation, going back to the sexual revolution and how women and men are relating to each other. I don't know if you've heard this, Nick. I don't know how much interaction you have with the younger generation, but there seems to be a lot of men who really have no direct interaction with women or seem not to know how to deal. And how much of that is just reliance on pornography or OnlyFans or what? And how much of that is a direct consequence or just another factor in this is something I can't answer. But I've been hearing about this more and more. And I was thinking about this because people want to say these guys they were taking advantage of her. No good guy would stand in that line.
Well, I think that's probably true about the failure that we have to associate. And I think it's not just between men and women. I saw a statistic. I think it was 40% of American men under 25 don't have a friend.
Mm, yeah. And let alone a girlfriend. But you hear about the loneliness epidemic. And I think a lot of times when I hear about people waiting longer to get married or not getting married, I usually tend to think about it primarily like economic terms, but it could also be that this alienation or this disconnect that's growing. And I understand why when people are talking about prostitution or pornography, they tend to focus on how it objectifies women and makes them this thing for men to use for gratification. And I'm not saying that's not overall the case, but when I notice how these men are being talked about with OnlyFans subscribers or the guys who were selected to participate in this I'll just call it event. Either they're perverts or predators or, just opportunists who will screw anything that moves, which to me is denying any kind of subjectivity or any kind of complexity. I think it's really limiting if we want to try to turn the ship around. That we're not going to get very far if we put that kind of binary on the men who are involved in this as consumers. I should say that Lily Phillips, apparently she's made over $2 million from her OnlyFans page. And I think she also comes from a fairly well-to-do family. And people want to make a lot out of this, that she organized this, planned it, screened the participants, and all of that. So it becomes difficult to use these old categories when trying to get a handle on how to understand the men who are involved in this.
I think in broad terms, people like Lily Phillips have existed before. People who are attempting to capture the limelight through doing some extreme act, some extreme sexual act, or some extreme provocative act. It's just in the olden days in the legacy media, you had sleazy guys like Max Clifford who would promote you and make sure that you were on the front page of the Daily Star and the Daily Sport and page 3 of the Sun. But that world is dead. That's not an important world. And the pronos, the people who made money by selling films on VHS tapes, they're gone too. So that whole layer of salaciousness that you could tap into in the kind of post-Mary Whitehouse deregulated world of media, that world is gone. I did a little bit of research before this podcast. OnlyFans has 80,000 creators and it's raking in $1.3 billion a year. So clearly there are people who can gravitate to the top of that new media environment, but they have to have an angle. And there's no Max Clifford anymore. There's no way in which you can use the Murdoch press's hatred of the British establishment to catapult your career as the future Melinda Messenger, or from a kind of pornographic environment to I'm a television icon. That world doesn't exist. And so clearly Lily Phillips is trying to tap into that using salaciousness and trying to grab headlines. And you mentioned media sources, old media, which has always functioned in that way, both denigrating but elevating, the provocateur.
Hi, Alexander.
Hello, Tara. Hello, Nick. Good evening.
So I was just about to do a little bit about Louise Perry and how she would characterize this as the likely outcome of the sexual revolution. But I want to make good use of your time. And we can start off with your Marxist-Leninist interpretation of the Lily Phillips cultural event and the reactions to it and how it's being framed.
It's kind of like the coming together of two particularly horrible strands, really. One is like the commodification of everything down in this particular period of capitalism, right down to what should be the most sort of sacred relations between human beings. There's an old quote from Marx which says, all that is sacred is profaned. And you can't get much more of a perfect summary of that being true than this story. It is a reduction of sex and sexuality in human relations down to the most dull, mechanical level, where all beauty is removed, all actual human feeling is drained out of it, and all that's left is literally a mechanical act of commodity production. The commodity in this case being the porn that was produced, and the act itself, again, being no more really human than the coming together of two bits of machinery. This is what immediately struck me. It brings together two things. One is the commodification of everything right down to the individual level. And then the second part is what I guess you've been talking about already, which is the end point of the so-called sexual revolution under what I'm going to refer to as late stage imperialism, which is decaying monopoly capitalism. And I think that with relation to the sexual revolution, I think that the term revolution is wrong for it, basically, because whilst I think perhaps all of us here would agree that there were certain things that happened in that period that did represent a certain amount of progress. I don't think anybody really wants to go back to the idea that consenting adults can't engage in the sexual behavior of their choice together. And nobody really wants to go back to, people being prosecuted for expressions of consensual adult sexuality. Nobody wants that. But what came with it is this faux liberation that imagined that being able to be more explicit, being able to, basically lay a woman in a bikini over the bonnet of a car, basically use sex to sell everything from cars to clothes to perfumes to washing powder, that wouldn't have a dangerous and damaging impact over time when you combine it with the other developments in British and American and Western European capitalism, which is where all this stuff grew up, born really in Madison Avenue and in the London advertising agencies. This is where it comes from. And when you put that together with the other changes we've had over the last 60 years, which is destruction of community, which is destruction of the bond that the long-standing communities had with the previous generations and commitment to maintaining certain things for future generations, all of that is gone in the atomization that followed in this country, particularly after the 1980s. An atomization which every single Westminster political party bangs on about from time to time. None of them have the faintest idea of what to do about it because none of them really know what caused it. And the culture has become infested with this doubly cynical view of human relations, which is some part of which comes from advertising and part of which comes from the porn industry, because the porn industry has had this huge influence over modern culture, because it's where ultimately a lot of the representations of human sexuality that you see in so-called mainstream productions comes out of the porn industry. It filters through. One of the centers of the porn industry is, of course, California, right next to Hollywood. They share a lot of personnel, historically speaking, and probably still to this day. So the vision that we grew up with, particularly when I'm thinking of myself, I grew up in the 90s into the early 2000s, the vision that young men grow up with of sexuality is a very cheapened one. And I can just remember it from being a teenage boy myself. The view that you were taught to have of women was the more the merrier, lads. Never mind other elements in human relationships, never mind feeling, never mind what makes the sexual act something that actually has any real purchase in the emotional side of things. It was already in the 90s reduced to this very cheap and alienating and mechanistic presentation of it. So when you add in the combined effects of the internet and the further social disintegration in Britain and in the United States, and then you throw in on top of that the way in which the gig economy has sort of merged with prostitution and the OnlyFans economy, you have this toxic combination of things. And then on top of that, you have the idea that if you do something extreme now, you can make a lot of money online. If you do some kind of extreme behavior event like Lily Phillips did, you'll get famous, you'll get a lot of money, you'll get a lot of recognition. She'll probably be on, some horrible American talk show before too long or something, explaining how it was so awful for her and she'd never do it again. But please buy my book. And that's the way out that's presented now to younger men and women as a way off the unrewarding track of jobs that don't mean anything, or an education process that doesn't get you into a better social position anymore. And we've gone from the cult of celebrity, which is what perhaps we all as like millennials grew up with, which was personified in the cheap magazines and supermarkets. It went from being, you could be a film star, to being, you could be a reality TV star, to you could bang 100 guys on camera. But that's the downward slope. And so therefore, in an extremely degenerated culture, in extremely degenerated countries like the United States and Britain in particular, that's what you get. I'm only surprised that this is the first case that I've heard of where this has happened.
Thank you, Alexander. Nick, do you have something you want to add or respond to that?
Broad general agreement with that. And that echoes what I was saying before. We did historically have an era in which television and media was tightly regulated by the government. And there was an effort to undermine that. And a fight back was led by conservatives. So we mentioned Mary Whitehouse before, and obviously the defeat of that effort to regulate media was seen as a progressive development, but it obviously had great consequences, and that has been met in the middle with the transformation of media. You know, obviously Alexander there mentioned the porn industry. There isn't really a porn industry in the way in which the 1990s, there were big companies paying stars loads of money and pumping out VHS tapes. That's gone. What's been replaced with, and I know you mentioned the gig economy, Alexander, uh, is OnlyFans. We mentioned that OnlyFans brings in $1.3 billion in revenue every year. It has 80,000 content creators. Very few of them will ever make any serious money, which is like the gig economy. But we were talking before about Max Clifford and the way in which the Murdoch press through the 90s and noughties, through spectacular, salacious events, you could get yourself on the front page of newspapers every day and transform yourself from the person who creates the pornographic film to the person who writes the novel and saying, yeah, I'd never do it again. And we have, as millennials, we have icons like that. I always remember Melinda Messenger, for example, presenting that escape show sort of thing. And that career ladder doesn't exist anymore. So you can see why individuals like Lily Phillips would avail themselves of it, but it is ever more alienated.
Yeah, and I was thinking about how can you keep this going? We know that at least with pornography that people start off at one place and it has to get progressively more, I guess, degenerate or extreme to have the same effect. But one thing that struck me when I was reading something about the documentary, it's not unusual in pornography. Before this stuff happens, they have the girl there talk with anticipation about what's going to happen. But then after the end, just ends. I'm not going to say how those things normally end. We all know probably how they normally end. But it seems that this might start a trend with, I hope it doesn't, but in addition to the gratuitous mechanical sex aspect of it, they follow her after the fact. So just as it doesn't end when the guys are done, they reflect on how she's feeling now, the regret, or trying to process it, or reflecting on how she only can picture 10 out of the 100 guys that entered her that day. And I'm thinking, oh, so in addition to the bodily, to the cheapening and the desacralization of that, now you have another layer of pornographic emotionality or something?
No, I think, Tara, this is actually just a feature of the social media age. If you recall, it's civilization and then the response, the ascent of man when color television had just been invented. There was a reverence for the presenter and the style. Someone like David Attenborough, who commissioned those programs, he led the development of color television. And when you watch his wildlife documentaries now, they have the same as usually a 5 to 10 minute section on we're the guys who made the film, and this is our feelings about the bird, and this is how we got the shot. And I think it's just we live in an era where the leitmotif of television production or media production is that you're approachable, that you know who the person is. It's that world where you can tweet them, and I think that is really about the alienation that has been created by these media, trying to say we are just Jim down the pub. You're not.
No, in many cases, you're very well paid, far above the average living standard of the average Brit or American. And you're not going to meet them in your local unless you, of course, you live in the media heavy bits of Manchester or London or Edinburgh. But this is the relatability aspect is a trick that, as Nick states in his contribution, it's a media trick. It's also a politician's trick. I think in our case, Blair was probably the first to market this, turning up and trying to pretend that this guy who went to Thet, the Eton of Scotland, and was like a pure product of a family that was training him for a high position in the British state. This guy was just Tony, not Anthony Charles Linton Blair, because that doesn't sound as friendly. But he was at least a half decent actor. And he tried to get Gordon Brown to do it, and my God, we all remember the results of that. In the American case, it probably happened a bit earlier. You could see aspects of it with JFK. But the guy who they really pushed it for was, of course, Reagan, approachable Ronnie. He's not the governor of California who thought the Black Panthers should all be shot. He's just an approachable guy in a Stetson. As bourgeois politics becomes ever more elitist and ever more divorced from any influence that the masses can hope to have over it, even in the small way that did perhaps exist in the immediate post-war era, the familiarity I'm your mate crap just gets doubled down upon all the time until we reach the excruciating sight of David Cameron, the old Etonian, doing webcam videos. You get Theresa May trying to appear relaxed, which was a sight which I don't think the nation will recover from anytime soon. Then you get someone like Boris Johnson, who is a good actor, so he can at least pull it off. And then Keir Starmer, a man more wooden than an entire forest worth of oak. They keep trying this and they keep doubling down on it because there's nothing in terms of influence that can be had over politics, over bourgeois politics. The only thing that they can provide is a show of themselves. I often found that it had become so heavily mediated, politics in Britain, and this was especially true in the David Cameron era, that for a lot of people, opposition meant purely appearing on television and making a speech. That was it. I remember there was like certain politicians who were big for it about 10 years ago who would lay into the Tories in Parliament, and they'd go on YouTube and people would say, yeah, go get it. What was it doing? Was it building serious opposition? No. Was it giving people a burst of joy through a mediated event? Yeah, that's what it was doing. And it's all part of the same thing. I am loath to go back to Guy Debord and the Society of Spectacle, but he was right about quite a few things. And the spectacle is what is endlessly provided. Bourgeois politics, just a spectacle. Human sexuality has just become a spectacle. Yeah, and everything that used to be organic has been reduced to the mechanical, as I was saying earlier. And that's the society that we live in now. I think it's especially developed here in Britain, the oldest capitalist and the oldest imperialist country, where our deindustrialization, hyper-commodification and alienation has gone further than anybody else other than the United States, which has probably surpassed us in terms of degradation. There's no way out under the existing balance of forces because people are compelled economically to literally either prostitute themselves literally or prostitute themselves emotionally, or as you were saying, to do both. So like Lily Phillips will do this, then go on and probably wail and weep and go on a half a dozen chat shows and say, I don't know what I was doing. That'll provide another media burst. And then maybe perhaps the finding of religion later on. Well, why not? That's another media round, isn't it? That's another book, My Path to God. Another book after that, My Path Away from God. And it's become as cynical as that. If people had to go at Mr. and Mrs. Markle, Harry and Meghan, because they are transparently playing that game, but they're just the top, a higher end of the tree that everybody's playing. So like the supposedly dignified face of the British establishment goes and prostitutes itself to make money just the same way as an online influencer would. And you see like conservative types getting very uptight about this. And that always makes me laugh a little bit. And I thought, well, you helped us get to this point. When it comes to a lot of these Tory types, you have to ask them, well, what did you expect? When you shattered the remaining industry in Britain, when you destroyed so many communities, when you promoted a culture of rabid individualism above everything else, where did you think it would end? What did you think Victorian values actually meant? Because it meant this. London in the 19th century infamously had one of the worst prostitution problems in the world, frequently because the rich were so enthusiastic users of prostitution. And so you flip forward 150 years, you have a modern day version of that. Higher level of technology, slightly different relations, but the same basic thing involved. And only now, as Nick was saying, it's not a direct pimp, though sometimes it is. It's a social media conglomerate. It's an OnlyFans. It's a Pornhub owned by serious financiers, traded on various stock markets, making huge returns for people. So again, things just repeat themselves at a higher and possibly even more obscene level.
All right. I backtrack a bit and go over Louise Perry, the case against the sexual revolution. The first part of it is an historical materialist explanation of the sexual revolution. I don't know if she especially says that or not. This isn't the first time that sexual norms were transgressed or played around with. I'm thinking of like the book Dangerous Liaisons. This elite class in the 60s, birth control could back up all the norms that were being transgressed, which made this a different situation. You had the pill, and also appliances, regular electricity that reduced the amount of household labor. So you have this perfect storm of the technological, you could say, forces of social reproduction or behind men and women's intimate relationships with the household appliances and all those conveniences that become more widespread. And then the pill, which separated sex from reproduction, or the risk of becoming pregnant from sex in a way that women could control, and that was visible with the pills being taken. Perry's book is about downside consequences, and what you would say is that there's a lot of people that recognize the issue but don't know what to do about it because they're missing important parts of the puzzle, which we would want to qualify as late stage imperialism, late stage capital. And so she talks about disenchantment. Like, I think that what would be a powerful critique or is a disenchantment with what we typically in Marxist critique call alienation. So what do we lose when sex becomes nothing special? Not just not sacred. She uses disenchantment so to describe the reduction of sex into something transactional, stripped of meaning and intimacy. She argues that the sexual revolution, for all its promise of freedom and empowerment, has left us disenchanted. Sex has been flattened into a purely physical act or mechanical act, like Alexander talked about before. So it's no longer even special. It's been totally demystified to the point of banality or spectacle and whatnot. And so to contrast that or marry that with Marx's concept of alienation, I know that Engels wrote a bit about the family, but he didn't write about sex directly. But the idea that capitalism alienates us from our labor, ourselves and each other is another species of that. Whereas workers are estranged from the products of our labor, modern sexual culture estranges us from emotional, relational aspects of intimacy. So we hear things like it's just sex or sex work is work. You have college campuses in the UK giving students, young women in particular, kind of like tips about how to supplement their income with OnlyFans or how to do it safely. But the idea that sex and intimacy is something that's being consumed, traded, and performed. We talked about, before Alexander came on, about how a lot of men in their 20s report they don't even have a close friend, or the only kind of connection they have with the opposite sex is through these types of platforms. And I don't think you can get more alienated than that, to the point that I think they don't even know how to interact with an actual face-to-face encounter. This is a symptom of alienation and disenchantment, whatever we want to call it. And it also requires us to suppress our instincts and emotional needs in favor of these ideologies that prioritize consumption and spectacle and quick fixes and whatnot. It's not just about the degradation of the act, but also has this broader ramifications in terms of people partnering up and family formation. And one thing I wanted to ask all of you is what this means to the family, and that it could be that it's beneficial not just to the market or capital accumulation, but also the state to further erode the family and the relationships between men and women.
Very briefly, Tara, we have the world's richest man owning a social media platform, which might be argued to be exacerbating alienation, deeply concerned about falling birth rates across the Western world. And obviously the discourse around migrants and refugees is either deracinating and destroying communities and undermining services, or necessary to pay for pensions with the falling birth rate. And no one wants to open Pandora's box and examine why actually families aren't being formed or being formed later, or birth rates are falling.
Laura, do you want to say something? And you're in darkness. You're shrouded.
I'm sorry.
Do you need a couple of minutes to collect yourself?
I jumped in. I remember Eleanor, Nick's wife, talking about paying attention more to certain moderate or even conservative sort of voices, like, trad femme kind of women in the US, and how they're all convinced that there's a conspiracy to destroy the traditional family by making men and women have to work. So everyone has to earn a wage, and thereby they destroy the family, as if the end goal is the destruction of the family as opposed to two people working. The problem there is that two wages are necessary to support a family. It's not like there's some secretive deep state, well, that's it. That's what they get out of it. In the same way that what they get out of sex work is women being easy to exploit.
Do you want to say something, Alexander and Nick?
Well, I think the conservatives see a communist conspiracy every time they see a symptom of capitalism, whether it's family destruction, where it must be the commies who are plotting to do it, and they're in charge, strangely, of the state and all the major employers. But every time this happens, you get a whole bunch of explanations, all of which avoids the two central issues. One of which was that women's mass entry into the labor force in British and American terms came at a time when the 20 plus year post-war upswing was coming to an end. So women workers enter more into the labor force when British capitalism is on the slide. And so what happens is that the British capitalist class manipulates the situation and pushes women into, of course, more low wage work, and uses the availability of a bigger section of the population as exploitable labor as one of the means by which they seek to suppress wages. That's just capitalism being capitalism. That's just the capitalist class acting as they do. If they destroy families along the way, well, they don't really care about that. It doesn't matter. The same attitude they had in the 19th century, which is, well, there's plenty more where they came from. If the ones that we've got domestically won't breed enough, well, we'll find others that will. It doesn't matter where they come from. Maybe we'll, loose a bunch of jihadists in their country, destroy it, and then we'll bring some over here and they can make up for the shortfall in the birth rate. If that seems like utterly cruel cynicism, well, that's just how capitalism is. And the problem that we've got at the moment, as I think you and I have discussed before, Tara, which is that the problem is that when you get all of this stuff, whether it's the pushing of prostitution as liberation, whether it's the gender ideology stuff, or whether it's the destroy a country and steal its workforce stuff, what you've got is a bunch of people on the right who keep screaming about communism and communist plots, and a bunch of people on the left who keep saying, yeah, but this is a good thing. So what you've got is basically a political debate between really two different halves of the ruling class. The working class voice got, in British terms, pretty much destroyed and pushed out of the equation probably about 40 years ago and hasn't come back yet. And so most of what we think of as the left, which runs around making excuses for all the alienation and miseries of capitalism, is just really they're doing the work of the left end of the ruling class. That's what they're doing. They're not a representation of the working class, either in Britain or the United States. And again, this comes back to our problem, which is when a lot of people see all these things happening and see the horrors that the system's producing, the only people producing critiques of it that get any purchase are people on the right. So they end up going towards them because the left seems bizarre, insane, and embracing of alienation. Whereas at least people on the right acknowledge there's a problem. Problem is that they don't have any solutions either, other than trust in Elon Musk, vote for Donald Trump, or vote for Nigel Farage. Not exactly the way forward for anybody, particularly anybody who's working class in this country, but that's the situation that bourgeois politics has got into now.
Yeah, there's an acknowledgement of the problem because you can see that, okay, people are getting married later or partnering up later. There's birth rates are falling. There's the OnlyFans and porn. People getting their base gratification, mediated by the market and the screens and all. That's going to have an impact on people partnering up. If people have to depend on the market or the state for more things than they do on their family, friends, and comrades, they're easier to control. They're more isolated. The relationship between undermining the family and capitalism, the same way with women in capitalism, because they get pushed in, they get pushed out, are not a historical. So the consequences and whether or not, or when those become profitable or not, or useful or not politically, are historical questions. The weakening of the family structure and more and more people staying single longer and longer. It does make OnlyFans and all that kind of stuff a lot of money to keep guys isolated and paying for their OnlyFans girlfriend than, having a real one. I think that there's obvious on family and intimacy the last 30 or 40 years.
Right. I was thinking of that quote, all that is sacred will be profaned. So everything that matters to people. Like that happened when people had to leave home and work. It happens when people have to spend more time away from their children. These are material realities of our economy, our society. So the problem is these right wingers, they don't have any more materialism than the left of it. That's what obviously breeds sin. Like when you've got a situation where people don't have housing, where they don't have access to healthcare, where there's no safety net. So in Glasgow, for example, with the homeless situation, you've got these ghetto sort of hotels that are being set up for homeless people, and then you've got separate ones for asylum seekers. And around those hotels, you end up getting a lot of drug pushing, a lot of sex trafficking, a lot of crime, and they become less safe areas, and everybody notices it in the city. But when it's asylum seekers, the right goes, ah, well, there you go, because they come from foreign culture and they don't respect women, and that's why they're all acting up. Well, that doesn't explain why we get exactly the same problems outside the hotels that are full of Scotch people. It's not about, being predisposed because of the kind of person you are to do these kinds of behaviors. It's about what happens when you're left languishing in a homeless hotel for up to 53 weeks, being targeted by pushers and pimps, surrounded by scary men in a scary situation. Anybody would go down that route. So it's, yeah, that's it. It's just the lack of material all around. It's like, it's very easy to talk about abstract. But it's true. I keep coming back to this thing of like, why does the left say this? That's not a left-wing position. That's why nobody's saying like, sex workers experience alienation, because they don't believe in the idea of alienation. The idea that people would be psychologically affected by the kind of work they do every day is a very Marxist thing, And so obviously it's the same for women. I've known sex workers. And yeah, it's awful. You walk into a room and you just constantly checking pictures of their body parts. It just becomes a whole psychology, and it's really sad. It's just one of the many symptoms. It's also a buyer's market. The idea that there's some kind of wealth of opportunity for girls to take their clothes off and make money.
The vast majority of people on OnlyFans are not making that much money, so they don't get the monetary payoff for whatever goes on psychologically. I don't want to psychoanalyze people, but a book paid for said that it takes a lot of effort. And so when Lily Phillips says she was training herself to be able to do 1,000 men a day, which I don't even think is possible time-wise, but it's beside the point. Part of the training is suppressing her natural instinct to be revulsed by having sex with men she's not wanting to have sex with. So there's consent, that's a legal thing. But the psychological overterm damage you have to do to train yourself to disassociate or to not actively react to the yuck factor when there's somebody you're not into at all on top of you're doing whatever. I think that's something that doesn't often come up in terms of the actual costs and why sex work, we would argue, is not like a hairdresser or something like that. That a lot of left people will think somehow it'll be better if we unionize prostitution and decriminalize it, that somehow that'll be great because sex work is work and women should be able to make their choices and this type of thing. Alexander, can you think of any valid Marxist argument for the sex work is work position?
No, but that's a rather short answer. I mean, I was at a union conference 10 years ago where this was debated, and it was debated along the lines that you've just been describing there, Tara. I was in the Public and Commercial Services Union, the Civil Servants Union. And it was presented as this great positive thing that prostitution is going to happen anyway. So wouldn't it be better if it was all legal? At the time, I didn't have the understanding that I do now. My branch at the time voted in favor of the motion to support unionization of what was referred to as sex workers because, we didn't think about it at the time. Thinking about it now, what we were essentially doing was endorsing a pimps union. That's what we were doing. There's no good argument for this. What you're essentially arguing for is like, here's an incredibly negative, wretched situation that capitalism has created. The way out of it is to do what? To say that it can somehow be made good. We don't want like women or men who are forced to sell themselves to be sent to prison. But the idea that this is something that is liberatory and should be celebrated, which is what you get from a lot of the left, and especially the United States these days, but also here and also France as well, is a ridiculous statement to make. And it's not backed up by anything within the Marxist canon whatsoever. What it's backed up by is a load of post-1960s theory that basically revolves around postmodernism. They sort of bastardizations of Foucault. It's bastardizations of the various other post-structuralists rather than anything to do with Marxism. They have, a lot of these leftists have internalized this idea that we must push the envelope of personal freedom further. And somehow, if we keep doing that, then capitalism will collapse. Somehow. No, what it'll do is it'll see what you're doing and say, that's a good market. We'll take it over and we'll do it on an industrial scale. That's what will happen. It's what happens with anything that gets like pushed through the legalization process. Like I spoke to somebody a while ago who lived in Portland, USA, where there's open legalized weed. And what happens is, of course, it goes from artisan weed stores to the cigarette company making it and selling it in vast quantities in a form that is just as harmful as an old Marlboro Red, basically. And that's what you get under capitalism. I used to argue a lot with like anarchists about we need to abolish the family now and that kind of thing. It's like, well, what the hell does that even mean? Capitalism's doing a good job of that on its own. It doesn't need you, Mr. Blacktop wearing anarchist, to help it. I had this argument recently online with people who swore they were Marxists and said, oh, Engels said abolish the family. And I said, no. What he wrote in Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State was that under socialism, the family would evolve into a socialistic form, just as under capitalism, the family evolved into a bourgeois form. And the argument of Marxists in the 20th century was that we wanted socialism to remove the material want aspect that destroys family life in order that we can actually build stronger family units that aren't crippled by material want and deprivation and alienation and all the toxic consequences of capitalism. That's what we actually want. We want to make something which is more stable, not less, which is not destroyed by alienation and hyper individualization. But the bulk of the left for over 30 years has worshipped all of this as a supposed path to liberation. Whereas in actual fact, they're just to inadvertently quote Fight Club, a copy of the radicals of the 1960s, whose legacy ultimately is one of failure because they failed to consider how they were throwing in their liberatory struggle into an unholy alliance with capitalism in its hyper-degenerate phase.
Thank you. Nick, Laura, do you want to say something?
Well, I mean, I come from a different philosophical perspective as a syndicalist, but I broadly agree with everything that Alexander said. I'd only know certain things. Whichever country it is in the Western world, when you poll women, they generally want around 2 children. And then we have these huge contradictions. 7% of the English are landlords. Around 4 and a bit percent of the Scottish are landlords. You have this huge extractive process which creates housing insecurity. And that's been driven by the state as a deliberate policy, really since the 1980s, drawing down on public housing, privatizing it, demolishing it. Myself and Laura have been heavily involved in a number of recent struggles around trying to preserve our public housing. And that's being removed in order to create a new market. And then, as I mentioned at Mary Whitehouse before, in the kind of conservative reaction against liberalism. But it wasn't all wrong. You know, the idea that we should regulate, it's just gone. Australia is having some kind of rearguard action with its ban on social media for under 16s, however that's going to work. And to me, it seems the horse is bolted. We're just in this position where we talk about the family. A dear friend of mine killed himself in his 20s of alienation and a lack of ability to connect. This is growing, and it is a contradiction in capital. There's no design. It's a contradiction for some aspects of capital, say landlords, the fact that young people can't get together and form meaningful relationships and have a family. It's irrelevant. It's not part of their business model. But at the same time, that depresses the ability of for example, the British working class to purchase things. So you have these contradictions. But yeah, it's all a great malaise.
Guys, I have to jump out now.
Any final thoughts? I guess we're just going to have to do it ourselves because the feminists that are on this, it seems like they're stuck in the moralization.
They think that they can trigger enough outrage and something will change. But that isn't just like the Julie Bindells have access to the major national media. everybody online thinks, well, enough outrage and something will happen. But of course, they're all stuck in a purely idealist mentality. Like, it takes a material change, as Nick was indicating. These are material problems that are creating all of this. The hyperalienation, the inability to make decent human connections, the inability to even just relate to a person of the opposite or the same sex, depending upon what your preferences are, makes me glad I was born in the 80s, because at least we were brought up having to relate to people face to face. But this is the world that's been created now. And until the material incentives to invest in this are removed, then it's all you're going to get. And the only way that you're going to be able to remove that is basically if you, leaving you on a revolutionary note, if the working class is organized enough to push this completely degenerate ruling class out of power, because they're not going to change. The only way we will see a serious revival in all aspects of our lives and culture is if the working class in whatever country we're in is organized enough to actually beat the ruling class in major industrial battles and major political battles, and rebuild working class politics in a way that it is separated from bourgeois politics, in a way that you had for a while in the 20th century, even in Britain, which had its problems. It certainly didn't have mass communist parties or communist-inspired trade unions like the French or the Italians did. But we had serious areas of the country where there was a real working-class political culture. The place I'm originate, South Manchester, was one of those. There's plenty of areas in Scotland, like the old coalfields, the old shipbuilding areas, the old steel towns of Yorkshire. And that was annihilated quite deliberately. It was principally motivated by profit, but it was also motivated by a desire to annihilate the working class's political culture. And so we need to be focusing on things like rebuilding that as a starting point, because unless we rebuild working class politics as a clear and coherent entity, then all the working class is going to be getting these two different halves of the same bourgeoisie, giving them two different bits of crap. Idealist nonsense from the right, idealist damaging, socially destructive stuff from the left. We need the class to break out of that. And I'll leave my comments there. So thanks to you, Tara, for having me on. Good to meet you, Nick, and you, Laura, as well. Hope to see you again sometime.
Thank you very much, Alexander. I really appreciate it. Everybody check out Alexander Mckay. I'll put his link in the description.